Hello pals, welcome back. So this is episode 2 of the Modern Magic series. And before we dive into this one, I just want to reiterate why I made this. So we are told by the scientific hardcore that UAP and fringe science, or pseudoscience as it's often derisively labelled, isn't worth studying because it doesn't follow the scientific method. That is frustratingly hypocritical. When what I wanted to achieve with this series is, first of all, pointing out that there are some seriously weird, magical, occult, esoteric references in our military and technological institutions. But secondly, talk about where they came from, and that's what this episode is about. So in this one, I've split it into three main fields of influence, which have affected and evolved into the modern scientific and technological institutions that we know and love. So the first section is going to be American occultism. The second is going to be German occultism, and you know that word that I can't use on YouTube. And the third one is going to be Masonic occultism. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy this, and let's get into it.
Well, take a look at this high-tech campus in La Cañada, Flint Ridge. This is the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, or JPL, and it's a federally funded research and development center that is focused on building spacecraft to explore outer space and other worlds. It's owned by NASA, and it's managed by Caltech in Pasadena. Their roots go all the way back to the 1930s with jets and rockets. Really began with Caltech professor Theodore von Karman, who was doing some pioneering work with rocket propulsion. His experiments had grown rather hazardous, though, on the campus of Caltech, and so him and his team of undergrad students moved to what was then a wilderness area north of the Rose Bowl. Von Karman had also been a scientific advisor to the U.S. Army and was working to develop jet engines. So the Army actually helped Von Karman and his team acquire some land here just north of the Arroyo Seco to set up some temporary workshops and test pits for the development of jet technology as well as the fledgling rocket technology. And then, of course, we had the onset of World War II. Obviously, his team was in incredibly high demand at that time. They got a massive infusion of federal money, and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory was officially born in 1943.
Well, what an absolutely normal, squeaky clean, and perfectly respectable establishment JPL and NASA seem to be from that clip. But that's only a tiny part of the story, and whilst von Karman certainly was a prominent figure in the formation of JPL, there's a much more interesting story to be told. So let's start with that. Now, the real story involves the self-professed most evil man in the world, his heir, the Beast, and a con man who went on to fool some of the biggest names in Hollywood today. So, let's start with the grandfather of modern rocketry, Jack Parsons. Jack Parsons, Frank Molina, and a team of young undergraduates would go out to the desert, mix powders together, and blow stuff up, earning them the early name of the Suicide Squad, which we know today from Hollywood. But it was his extracurricular activities which Jack was drawing a lot more attention from. And he was a member of the Church of the OTO, and also a member of the AA. The AA was a heavily Masonic group, and the OTO was something a lot more magical. And this is where he met his mentor. Aleister Crowley, or the most evil man in the world as he used to refer to himself, was a metaphysicist and head of the Church of Thelema. He was fascinated by the liminal side and the absolute limits of what we knew to be reality. And he tested this by encouraging chaos in every facet of his life. He felt that chaos was creativity at its absolute limits, and so therefore would be the easiest way to understand it, although he would encourage this through an incredibly disciplined and strict regime of routine and rituals. And it was this duality which attracted Parsons to the teachings of Crowley. Now, at this point, Jack was already in communication with prominent and promising rocket scientist Wernher von Braun, this being prior to the outbreak of World War II. But in a strange twist of fate, it would be the rise of the Nazis and the start of the Second World War, which would catapult Jack and his team to worldwide fame. As the army, this being prior to the formation of the Air Force, would award a $20,000 contract to anybody that could perfect the means of jet-assisted takeoff, a way of blasting a plane into the air on a shorter runway using rockets, as previous attempts had been both hazardous and very, very inconsistent. And so the Suicide Squad became Aerojet, which later formed the Jet Propulsion Lab. And in fact, Jack was so integral to the Jet Propulsion Lab that it was nicknamed the Jack Parsons Laboratory. Aleister Crowley described magic as the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will. And the parallels between this and the amateur days of rocketry are clear to see. Jack and his team would be in the desert mixing together mysterious powders and practices with the goal of one day sending man to the stars. And it was during the rituals of the OTO where Jack seemed to gain great insight into what he was doing in the desert. The practices and rituals involved a heavy dose of sexual components, so they would be based loosely on Masonic practices and study of the stars and celestial elements, but they felt that by harnessing sexual energy, they could gain greater power and insight into the mysteries of the world. And these rituals would often conclude with literally channeling a non-human intelligence in order to gain favor and information. And potentially it was during one of these rituals that Jack had the inspiration to mix roofing tar with his black powder and invent the world's first liquid rocket fuel. America's space race had unofficially begun. Although Crowley and Parsons never met, they communicated frequently by letter and had the relationship of father and son with all of the frustrations and ups and downs that come with it. But a third character entered the mix, and this was cult leader and conman L. Ron Hubbard, who at the time was a naval officer which took up residence in Jack's house and soon adopted the practices of the OTO, later becoming Jack's scribe. Now, I could go into much more detail about this because it's absolutely fascinating, but it's not really relevant to this video. But let's just say that Hubbard ended up stealing all of Jack's money and his girlfriend, and then stealing Crowley's lessons in order to form Dianetics, which was the precursor to the Church of Scientology, which we know today, which still goes on to exploit the rich and powerful around the world. So we'll be covering him a little more in the next episode, but for now let's get back to Jack. Jack's life would come to an end in the 50s. After he'd left JPL, he went on to make squibs used in Hollywood. Squibs are, if you've ever seen a cowboy movie, it's the little charge that they put under their clothes to make it look like you've been shot. And Jack hammered out a living after losing all of his money to Hubbard and that scheme by making minor explosives used in the Hollywood movies. And it was during the preparation of a last-minute batch of these that Jack dropped a coffee can full of extremely volatile material and mortally wounded himself and destroyed the entire building in the process. However, JPL would go on to form the absolute cornerstone of NASA, which is ongoing to this day. In fact, in modern times, Jack is remembered by having his very own crater on the dark side of the moon, an eternal tribute to one of rocketry's greatest pioneers. Well, before we get into this is going to get pretty dark, and I don't like doing that at all on this channel. And neither does YouTube, and therefore this video is almost definitely going to be demonetized as a result of what I'm about to talk about. So if you think this video is worth a coffee, then there's a link to buy me one in the description below, or even better, buy yourself something cool from the store. Anyway, let's get into it. Now, I'm sure you're aware of Operation Paperclip, which was the acquisition and distribution of Nazi scientists at the end of World War II. But what you may not be quite so familiar with is Operation Lusty, which was before the end of the war, where predominantly the British would send spies into Nazi-held areas of high research, science and technology and attempt to steal these Wunderwaffen from under the noses of the then embattled Nazis. But it was during Operation Paperclip where the Allies could finally acquire the people that had dreamt up and built these magnificent machines in order to catalyze immeasurable progress in science, technology, and militaristic pursuits. Now, of course, there was outcry, particularly from the Jewish element of the United States, that they were embracing their former sworn enemies. However, this was swiftly overshadowed by a concerted propaganda effort from the American and British governments about the Red Threat and communist sympathizers. In fact, many employees of JPL itself lost their jobs due to accusations of communism and sympathy for the Russians. And so this is probably no better summed up than by Werner von Braun. I'm not going to mince words. This guy was a monster. He is touted as an American hero, and the statue of him outside the Kennedy Space Center calls him a German immigrant who became a rocketry pioneer and lived the American dream. He was a major in the SS. And what I have to make very, very clear is the difference with the Nazis is that it wasn't a political party, it was a almost religious party. It was a spiritual belief, one based on deep occultism, supremacism, eugenics, exploring occult concepts to recover the power of the gods, the Übermensch, and purify the gene pool at the same time. And the thing with religious beliefs is you can't conquer them from the outside. For example, Britain and the Romans is the perfect example of this. We were invaded and conquered by the Romans countless times. And the pagan beliefs which existed and were held by the Britons were never destroyed and crushed and converted. They just go underground for a little while. And as long as you abide by the rules of your new conquerors, then all is well. And so, very much the same is applicable to the Nazi scientists, SS officers, bodyguards, and soldiers that flooded into America over the next 15 to 20 years. Now, if you're wondering whether the propaganda machine continues to this day, we'll look no further than von Braun's Wikipedia entry. Now, many people interested in ufology are well aware of just how corrupt and biased and lopsided Wikipedia can be. It is the modern mouthpiece for propaganda. And this is no exception. So, after a brief mention of his time with the Nazis, without going into any details, we focus on the wonderful things he achieved for America and the scientific and technological revolutions that this caused. But we leave out things like the fact that over 10,000 people died in slavery building von Braun's rockets whilst he was still over in Germany. In fact, more people died in slavery building them than were ever killed with them fired at in anger during World War II.
Nazis. I hate these guys.
I could go on and on and on about this, but I don't want to. So let's change it up a little bit and we'll talk about the Masons.
Now, if we're going to talk about the Masons, then first of all we need to talk about the Knights Templar. And they were essentially the world's first breakaway civilization, dealing with high technology, a great deal of esotericism, and they were heavily invested in symbols and secrecy due to the nature of what they did. They had to be able to pass information to branches all around the world without giving away any of their secrets should any of them be compromised. And they, within 200 years, through a perfection of the technologies involved in stonemasonry, built cathedrals and churches all around the world, just like this one. The true artistry of these buildings is reflected in the tiny details and subtle symbology noticed only by the initiated, with no detail being frivolous or random, but all echoing an overall narrative.
As you can imagine, to coordinate buildings of such incredible complexity, you had to be phenomenally well organised. And this is where the terms that we still know today, like apprenticeships and journeyman and mastercrafted. All of this started with the Masons, who would train up in their secrets and principles and then send those people around the world so that they would have a uniform level of standards. Another example of Masonic symbology is in the tarot deck, where almost every card and different combinations of them can be interpreted by somebody initiated in their true meanings, which is hidden in plain sight from the viewer and observer that might pick them up at random. So what are these symbols? Well, it's not strictly relevant for me to dive into great detail now, but you can, and I really recommend that you do. It mainly consists of stonemasons' tools, items of architecture, and more esoteric things like the double-headed eagle and the Eye of Providence. But once you start noticing them, you can see them all over the place, and this is no coincidence when you understand that most of the people that helped shape our culture and the buildings that we live in the Western world were prominent Masons. Let's take a little look at just a few prominent Masons through history. This makes sense then when you consider that George Washington, seen here laying the cornerstone for the Capitol with the gavel, the trowel, and other prominent powerful Masonic symbols, designed Washington from the ground up using Masonic symbols and accurate sacred geometry, with exactly the same attention to detail as the Templar Masons that built the great cathedrals from all around the world. Even the ultimate symbol of American culture, the dollar bill, is packed with Masonic sigils and symbols. This is the currency of global trade, showing the Masonic influence all around the globe.
This is Apollo Saturn launch control, T-minus 3 hours, 4 minutes, 32 seconds and counting. Right on time as far as the astronaut countdown is concerned. The prime crew now departing from their crew quarters. 10, 9, ignition sequence start.
But the Masonic influence wouldn't end on Earth, because on the 16th of July 1969, the Masons went to the moon. The formation of NASA was again heavily involved with Masonic influences, and all of the primary astronauts involved in the moon landings were Masons. In fact, a Masonic ritual was conducted on the moon itself, and a Masonic flag remains there to this day. This is the ultimate anchor of the as above, so below, and symbols related to keeping your eyes on the stars, and the phrase ad astra per aspera, to the stars from struggle, is a Masonic Roman Latin symbol still used to this day, associated with space travel and the conquest of the stars. Now, when I was little, I was very, very lucky enough to go and see the Space Shuttle Columbia take off, and it was probably the most life-changing and affecting philosophical moment of my entire life. The power and brutality of that thing ripping itself away from the earth and into the sky, out of sight, against and in pure defiance of gravity and the laws of nature, was indescribable. And I've been on the front row of a Black Sabbath gig, so I have some idea of what that feels like. And you can clearly see why people interested in the sacred and Masonic side and deep magic of the world would be fascinated and fully integrated in space travel. Now, I do feel like I should also say, when I used to work in hotels, I used to organize the function rooms and stuff like that. And I actually used to host several Masonic lodges. And it was very interesting. It would normally be a lot of very distinguished people, and they'd guard the function room with a guy with a broadsword stood there. And regularly, I could just go to my office and watch the CCTV and see exactly what was going on. And there wasn't any bizarre, weird sex magic like Jack Parsons or, chanting and rituals. There was none of that. But there was a lot of people involved that were local councillors and police officers and planning permission guys and, environment agency guys. And a lot of people who you could see, if they weren't so adherent to the code of honour, could have a lot of influence on each other's careers. So all I'm saying is that whilst the main body and the tree and the core of Masonic intent may be completely legitimate, without oversight, you always have the opportunity for perversion of the ideals. You can see that in most modern religions, where how far they differ from their original teachings in order to benefit the modern day practitioners. But that's all I'm going to say about that, really. In fact, Masonic practices are so integral to NASA and the entire infrastructure involved in space travel that even the names Apollo, Orion, Artemis, Osiris Rex, it is fundamentally referential to Roman mythology and Greek mythology and Egyptian mythology. And you can see that in the symbols used in the patches, the names of the missions, even the names of the craft, including things like Atlantis, which is from the Nazi mythology. The point is, when you then see people like Dr. Diana Pazulka, one of the most foremost experts on religion and faith and mythology, making these connections between the ritualistic behaviors going on behind the scenes, but then not making that final link to what the actual cause is. I find that a little bit strange. Have a look at this clip.
Yeah, it was really interesting. And what I found was that our space program today even has some really interesting rituals associated with it when it does certain launches at Cape Canaveral. Maybe not all of them, but the one that Tyler was involved with, they had images of Roman gods and goddesses put on the rockets. They would use Latin on their patches, their mission patches. And they would also have specific rituals that they would do, sometimes involving U.S. presidents. They would position the presidents at a certain point where astronomical events, would happen. And this, so Tyler had,
like the president of the United States.
Yes, the president of the United States. They didn't know what they were doing. They were just being positioned there. So, they're like, stand here, Mr. Obama or President Obama. And he would stand there with his wife and look this direction. It was part of the whole thing. And there were photos. He has photos of all of that.
Can you be a little more specific? Why would they stand him in a
Well,
certain...
see, okay, so this is obviously some type of ritual. And I don't know why they're doing it. I just know that I'm a scholar of religion. I know a ritual when I see one. He didn't even understand it. So I noticed that they were using Latin, and I noticed it wasn't medieval Latin. I was like, this is a particular form of Latin. It seems like it's Roman theology. So, they're using the images of Roman gods. And I would ask him, I said, why are you using the images of Roman gods? Why are you putting them on your mission patches and also utilizing Latin phrases from that time period? You're sending it up into space. Who up in space is going to read Latin? And his answer was, our sponsors. So, I mean, that's what he said. And so he also had all
Which
of,
Roman gods, do you know?
yeah, so there would be obviously Apollo, right? So all the missions, if you think of all the missions, they're all those gods and goddesses.
Hmm. Do you have any ideas of where this stems from?
It could, okay, so I do. It's just a theory though. So I could be completely wrong, but it seems to me that there might be an element within our government that maintains this theological tradition, this Roman theology.
Now, I would be the first to admit that I am not the brightest bulb on the Christmas tree, but even I can see that there are clear, obvious, on the nose references to Masonic symbology and practices, esoteric studies, and even the magical rituals as performed by Aleister Crowley and Jack Parsons back in the Mojave Desert in the 40s, at the very birth of the American space race. But if you really believe that all of these secret societies and magical cabals are a thing of the past, well, in the words of our modern day Werner von Braun, my heart goes out to you. I hope you really, really enjoyed this. As I said, it's probably going to get demonetized, so if you feel like it's worth a coffee, that would be fantastic. And I will see you for the next one.